The wood is already wet from last night's rain, but the rope bites anyway, fibers grinding into skin, sticky with sweat and old blood. Someone nearby retches. The air smells like iron and sour wine. And the man tied there, gray-bearded, broad-shouldered, once a fisherman, he isn't begging for mercy the way you'd expect. He's arguing. Not with the soldiers. With death itself. Not like him, he rasps, choking on his own breath. Turn it. A Roman shrugs. A hammer rises. And in that sick little pause, between the soldier's bored exhale and the first nail-finding flesh, you realize something that should make your stomach twist. This man has seen miracles, walked with the Son of God, and still chose to die in a way that looks like humiliation. Because this is St. Peter, Apostle Peter, the first pope, the rock, the one history remembers. Not for being unbreakable, but for breaking, and then coming back. And the question is, how does a man go from the stink of fish guts on his hands to a death that shook empires, and then somehow end, up-loved, fiercely loved, thousands of miles away in Nigeria? Rewind. Before the rope, before Rome, before he became Peter, he was simply Simon, one more boy in Galilee, where life tasted like salt and dust. You can picture it even if the details are lost, a childhood measured not by birthdays, but by storms, not by toys, but by tools. In a fishing village, boys learned two languages early, wind and hunger. His world was not soft. The Sea of Galilee could look like glass in the morning and turn into a fist by afternoon. Nets tore, boats cracked, men disappeared. The lake didn't care about prayers. It demanded muscle and timing, the kind of skill that grows in the bones. Fishermen weren't romantic figures then. They were laborers who smelled like work, who came home with wrists raw from rope burn and shoulders bruised by hauling water-heavy netting. Simon grew into that smell. He learned to read the ripples and the birds, to listen for that subtle change in the air that said, "Move now or die out there." He learned the brutal arithmetic of survival. A good catch meant food, a bad one meant debt, and debt, in their world, was a slow leash. Because Rome hovered over everything like a boot you could never quite see, only feel. Taxes were taken like a second harvest, by officials who wore clean robes and carried ledgers that didn't care if your children were thin. You could do everything right and still end up owing money you didn't have, trapped in a cycle where your life belonged, piece by piece, to people who never smelled fish once in their lives. That pressure makes a certain kind of man, not a saint. Not yet. It makes someone quick to speak, quick to fight, protective of his own, and allergic to being controlled. If Simon had a talent in his youth, it wasn't holiness. It was force. The kind of stubborn, hot-blooded force that keeps you alive when the lake is black and the wind is screaming. And it made him rivals. In Capernaum, where he likely worked from a base near the water, fishermen didn't just compete with nature. They competed with each other. The best spots weren't labeled. They were taken. The best markets didn't wait. They bought from whoever arrived first with the freshest catch. There were the sons of Zebedee, James and John, men with their own boat, their own crew, their own family operation. They were not strangers. They were the kind of competitors you see every day until their faces get etched into your mood. Imagine a morning when the water is calm and deceptive. Simon and his brother Andrew are already out, hands numb, casting and pulling. In the distance, Zebedee's boat cuts a clean line through the lake like it owns the horizon. The rivalry isn't polite. It's lived. It's in the way you pull faster when you see their nets rising. It's in the way you feel your jaw tighten when you hear their laughter carry over the water. And then, twist, on the days Simon wins, it doesn't feel like victory. It feels like a temporary pardon from disaster, because every fish he hauls is a reminder. Tomorrow, the lake can empty. Tomorrow, a storm can roll in. Tomorrow, Rome can raise taxes. Tomorrow, sickness can take a child. You don't win in Galilee, you endure. That endurance shaped his relationships, too. Simon was not a monk in training. He wasn't sheltered. He was a grown man with responsibilities early. Working hands, adult worries, the kind of fatigue that sits behind the eyes and never fully leaves. Tradition holds that he had a wife. The Gospels imply a household because Jesus later heals Simon's mother-in-law. That means Simon lived the regular grinding reality of providing, not just for himself, but for family. So picture him returning after a night of bad fishing. Empty nets, empty stomach, the kind of failure that feels loud even in silence. He steps onto shore and sees a tax collector speaking to someone, gesturing toward a ledger. He doesn't need to hear the words to feel the threat. Debt is a predator. It circles quietly. In that moment, Simon's faith, whatever it was in his youth, would have been less like poetry and more like a clenched fist. The God of Israel was real to him, but so were calluses. He prayed, sure, but he also swore. He believed, sure, but he also bargained, give me a catch and I'll... And then, if the catch didn't come, anger would rise like bile. That's important, because people later imagined saints as soft light. Simon was more like flint. He sparked fast. He could be brave and foolish in the same breath. And the world around him wasn't calm enough to let anyone stay neutral. Galilee in the 1st century was tense, threaded with talk of deliverance and despair. People whispered about a Messiah the way hungry people whisper about bread. Some waited quietly. Others sharpened knives in their minds. There were zealots who wanted revolt, priests who wanted order, and ordinary families who just wanted to survive without being crushed. Between empire and expectation, Simon grew up hearing stories about kings and prophets, about Moses defying Pharaoh, about David the shepherd becoming a ruler. Those stories weren't bedtime comfort. They were fuel. They told him that God could flip the world over, that power could be embarrassed, that the mighty could drown, and the enslaved could walk free. But there's a cruel irony when you live under Rome. The more you believe God can do anything, the more furious you become when your life still feels small. So Simon's early adulthood was not a straight line toward holiness. It was a tug-of-war between hope and bitterness, between the promises of Scripture and the daily humiliation of scraping by. And in that tug-of-war, he developed an instinct that would later define his greatest moments and his worst failures. He acted first. When someone insulted him, he didn't swallow it. When a deal felt unfair, he didn't smile politely. When danger came, he didn't freeze. He moved. That instinct saved him on the water. It also planted the seeds of the kind of mistakes that can haunt a man forever. And then there was Andrew. Andrew, his brother, is often remembered as the quieter one, the connector, the man who hears something new and doesn't immediately punch it. If Simon was fire, Andrew was the hand that sometimes kept the flame from becoming a house fire. You can almost see their dynamic. Andrew listening to rumors with curiosity, Simon dismissing them with a snort. Andrew watching a crowd gather, Simon staying near the nets, suspicious of anything that smells like trouble or wasted time. Because crowds can be dangerous. Crowds attract attention. Attention attracts Rome. But Andrew at some point starts hearing a name more and more. A voice in the wilderness. A prophet dressed rough. A man calling people to repentance in the Jordan. John. For Simon, that might have sounded like yet another religious disruption. Another wave of emotion. Another promise. Another thing that will change nothing. Fishermen don't have patience for speeches when their livelihood depends on weather. Still, the rumors wouldn't stop. People said John spoke like an axe striking wood. People said he called vipers vipers. People said he baptized the desperate, washed them in river water as if the world could be cleansed by something as simple as surrender. And then came the more dangerous rumor. John spoke of someone coming after him, someone greater. Someone who would not just splash water on skin, but set hearts on fire. For a man like Simon, that kind of talk is both irresistible and infuriating. Irresistible because it hints at meaning beyond the grind. Infuriating because it threatens to make you hope again. Hope is risky. Hope makes you careless, and Simon could not afford careless. So he stayed with the nets. He stayed with the routine. He stayed with the known misery rather than gamble on the unknown miracle. But life has a way of dragging you into the story you're trying to avoid. One day the lake would be uncooperative, like it often was. Nets would come up disappointingly light. The sun would rise, painting the water gold like an insult. The men would return to shore tired, irritated, smelling of night and sweat. And there, on the edge of Simon's world, between water and land, between labor and rest, there would be voices, a gathering, the shape of a crowd forming like a storm cloud that isn't made of rain, but of expectation. Crowds have a sound, not one sound. Many. Murmurs, shuffles, children, arguments, laughter that doesn't belong to laughter. It's the sound of people who want something and don't know how to ask for it. Simon would have seen crowds before. Teachers came and went. Political hotheads ranted. Temple visitors talked big. But this crowd felt different in the rumors that preceded it. And in the center of it, so the whispers would soon say, stood a man who didn't shout to be heard. That's where Simon's youth ends. Not with a neat moral lesson, not with a halo descending, but with a pressure building on the shoreline of his life. The same pressure he'd known from storms and taxes, now taking a new form. What if the world is about to change? And what if you're the kind of man who misses it because you were too busy surviving? He doesn't know it yet, but the rivalry that will define his destiny is already approaching. Not just rivalry with Rome, not just rivalry with other fishermen, but rivalry with a darker kind of competitor. Anyone who offers power without truth, glory without sacrifice, a shortcut to the human hunger for wonder. And Simon, who has lived his whole life chasing what keeps him alive, is about to meet someone who asks him to chase something else entirely. And once that happens, once Simon steps out of the familiar stink of fish and into the dangerous brightness of calling, there will be no returning to normal. Not for him, not for the people who will follow him, not even for places he's never heard of yet. Places like Nigeria, where centuries later his name will still be spoken with fierce respect. The crowd kept pressing closer, not because they were polite, but because desperation has elbows. Simon was rinsing nets in the shallows, hands moving by habit, mind still bitter about the night's empty haul, when the noise on the shore shifted. It wasn't the roar of a riot or the cheer of a festival. It was something subtler and more unsettling. A mass of people listening so hard you could almost hear their hunger. And then the stranger stepped toward the water as if the lake itself belonged to him. He didn't look like a priest. No polished linen, no temple perfume. He looked like the kind of man you'd pass on a road and forget, until he spoke. When he spoke, people stopped fidgeting. The way you stop when you realize the story you're hearing is about you. Simon's first instinct was irritation. Crowds caused trouble. Trouble invited Rome. Rome invited consequences. He kept his eyes on the net, kept scrubbing algae and grit like he could scrub the noise out of the air. But the crowd surged again, and suddenly the stranger was right there, close enough that Simon could see dust on his sandals, sun on, his cheek. A calm that didn't ask permission. "Let me use your boat," the man said. Not a request, not a demand. A sentence said like it was already decided. Simon's jaw tightened. A boat wasn't a stage. It was his living. The wood under his feet was paid for with years of sore muscles and borderline starvation. Letting a stranger climb in felt like letting someone put their hands on your throat. Yet something about the man's eyes, steady, unafraid, made Simon do what he rarely did. He swallowed his pride. He nodded once, sharply, and shoved the boat out. The lake lapped against the hull as Simon held it in place. The stranger sat down and began to teach from the water, his voice carrying over the surface like it was built for this. And Simon tried not to listen. He failed, because the words didn't float harmlessly in the air. They landed hard. Not like academic arguments in the synagogue. Not like slogans from hotheads dreaming of revolt. This teaching felt like a blade sliding between ribs, painful, precise, exposing what Simon didn't want exposed. The exhaustion, the rage, the secret fear that his whole life would be nothing but nets and debt and death. When the stranger finally paused, the shoreline was unnaturally still, like even the birds were holding their breath. Then the man looked at Simon, really looked, and said, "Put out into deep water. Let down your nets for a catch." Simon almost laughed. Almost. It was morning. The wrong time. The fish would be deeper, scattered. They had worked all night. Professionals. Men who knew the lake like you know your own scars. A voice inside Simon hissed, "This is foolish. This is humiliation. You're about to perform failure in front of a crowd." He could see it already. The nets dropping, the slow pull, the nothing. The crowd's disappointment curdling into mockery. Simon the fisherman outperformed by a wandering teacher. And yet, he did it. Maybe because he was tired and didn't have the strength to argue. Maybe because that calm in the man's eyes made refusal feel strangely impossible. Maybe because hope is a poison that smells like medicine. Simon rowed out. The water darkened beneath them. He threw the nets. The rope slid through his hands. The nets sank. For a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then, impact. Not a tug. Not a nibble. A violent, sudden weight, like the lake itself had grabbed the net and refused to let go. Simon jerked forward. His hands burned as rope snapped tight. He hauled. The net rose, and the water erupted with life. Fish. Too many. Impossible numbers. Thrashing silver in sunlight, bodies slamming against each other, scales flashing like knives. The smell hit Simon's face, raw and oily and real, so intense it felt obscene. The net bulged grotesquely, threatening to tear. Simon shouted for help. His voice cracked. Another boat rushed in. James and John, the rivals, the competitors, the ones he'd spent years trying to beat. And here was the twist that tasted like humiliation. He needed them. Together they pulled, arms straining, boats dipping dangerously low, water sloshing over the sides. For a terrifying moment, Simon thought they might sink, drown under blessing. The crowd on shore erupted, not in polite applause, but in the kind of sound people make when they realize something has shattered the rules of their world. Simon stared at the fish, then at the stranger, and something inside him folded. Not pride, not triumph. Fear. Because storms on the lake made sense. Taxes made sense. Rivalry made sense. This did not. This felt like standing too close to holiness, like realizing you've been living in a locked room and someone just opened the door. To a sky so huge it makes you dizzy. Simon dropped to his knees in the boat, fish flopping around him, water and slime soaking his clothes. His voice came out low, ragged, ugly with honesty. "Go away from me," he said. I'm not the kind of man you think I am." He expected condemnation, or laughter, or a lecture. Instead, the man said gently, "Don't be afraid." Then, like a hook set deep in flesh, "From now on, you will catch people." That sentence should have sounded ridiculous. It should have sounded like manipulation. But Simon knew the difference between a con and a calling. A con flatters you. A calling exposes you. And Simon, standing in the stink of fish and miracle, felt exposed down to the bone. He went back to shore. And here's the moment that would later sound clean in sermons, but felt wild in real life. He left the boats. He left the nets. He left the entire structure of his survival. People love to romanticize that part. They imagine a cinematic slow-motion walk into destiny. But reality is messier. Reality is a man stepping away from his livelihood while his brain screams, "What are you doing? You have a family. You have obligations. You can't eat faith." Yet he walked. And James and John, those rivals, walked too. It's hard to overstate how shocking that is. In Simon's world, you didn't abandon your trade. You inherited it. You clung to it. Your hands were shaped by it. It was identity. So what kind of power does a man have to make fishermen abandon the only certainty they've ever trusted? Not the power of a sword, not the power of money, the power of meaning. Simon followed him. The stranger had a name, Jesus, and in days that followed, Simon realized that the miracle of fish was only the opening move, because Jesus didn't just challenge the lake, he challenged everything. He walked into places where sickness clung to people like a curse and touched them without flinching. He spoke to outcasts like they were human. He looked at the proud like he could see through their robes into the rot underneath. He talked about God not as a distant judge, but as a father, close enough to hear you breathe. And Simon, who had grown up with God as law and thunder, felt something shift, not comfort, not ease, conflict. Because the more Simon saw, the more he realized following Jesus was not a path to safety. It was a path straight into danger. First came the synagogue. A man convulsed, screaming, eyes wild. Whether possessed, sick, or shattered by life, the effect was the same. Terror in public. People recoiled. No one wanted to touch him. No one wanted to be the one who got contaminated by his chaos. Jesus didn't step back. He stepped forward. He spoke, and the man dropped like a puppet whose strings were cut. Silence slammed down on the room, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Then the man's breathing steadied. The crowd stared. Simon stared. And somewhere in Simon's mind, a thought formed that was both thrilling and disgusting. If this is real, then the world is not what we think. And if the world is not what we think, then everything I've built my life around, fear, control, survival, might be a lie. That's not an easy realization. It's the kind of truth that makes people lash out. And Simon did lash out in his own way. He started trying to control the story. He'd watch Jesus heal someone and immediately scan the crowd for witnesses, for threats. He'd see people's faces. Some awestruck, some greedy, some calculating. He knew that look. Fishermen recognized predators. The predators were not only Romans, they were religious authorities too. Scribes and Pharisees began to appear like shadows. Clean hands, clean clothes, sharp eyes. Men who believed holiness was a border wall, built to keep the wrong people out. At first, they didn't attack openly. They watched. They asked questions with smiles that didn't reach their eyes. Why does he eat with sinners? Who gives him authority? Simon hated them immediately, not because he understood theology, but because he understood power. He'd seen officials at docks taking taxes with polite cruelty. These men had the same vibe, control disguised as righteousness. And then, another twist. Jesus didn't avoid them. He provoked them. He healed on days they didn't want healing to happen. He forgave sins as if he owned the right. He spoke parables that made the powerful feel stupid in front of peasants. For Simon, it was exhilarating and terrifying. Like watching someone poke a sleeping bear with a stick while you're standing right beside him. But the most dangerous rivalry, the one that would quietly poison the group from the inside, didn't arrive wearing religious robes. It arrived wearing friendliness. Because among the followers, there was another man, intelligent, controlled, a man who kept track of money and logistics, a man who looked like he belonged in rooms where decisions got made, Judas. At first, Simon didn't see him as an enemy. Not openly. Judas was useful, practical. While Simon was impulse and muscle, Judas was calculation. And that's how rivalries start. Not with hatred, but with comparison. Simon could feel it in small moments. A glance when Jesus praised Simon's boldness. A quiet smirk when Simon stumbled over words and Judas spoke smoothly. The group began to form its gravity. Who stood closest, who understood more, who might become the right hand of the teacher. Simon wasn't stupid. He felt the competition like a splinter under skin, and it dug deeper because Simon's devotion was real. But so was his ego. He wanted to be the closest, the most trusted, the one Jesus leaned on. Not because he was holy, because he was hungry. Then came the day Simon's old life tried to claw him back. They entered Simon's home, and his mother-in-law lay fevered, skin hot, eyes glazed. Fever then wasn't a mild inconvenience. It could be a death sentence. Simon's house, His supposed safe place suddenly became another battlefield. Simon watched Jesus step to her, take her hand. That simple touch, ordinary, intimate, felt like a violation of the rules Simon had always lived under. Illness made people untouchable. Illness meant distance. Jesus did not distance himself. The fever broke. Not gradually, not with days of recovery. It snapped like a branch. She sat up. Color returned to her face. Strength returned to her limbs, so immediate it made the room feel unreal. She began to serve them, moving with the energy of someone who should still be trembling. Simon's throat tightened. This wasn't a crowd miracle. This was personal. This was God stepping into his kitchen. And Simon realized with a jolt he could no longer pretend this journey was a temporary detour. It had entered his home. It had rewritten the terms of his family's life. That night, the door didn't stop knocking. People came in waves, limping, blind, bleeding, coughing, haunted. Lanterns flickered. The air filled with moans and prayers. Simon's home became a clinic, a shrine, a riot of need. Jesus healed. Again and again. And Simon, standing in the chaos, felt something that wasn't just awe. He felt responsibility. Because if Jesus was this dangerous to the old world, then everyone near him would become a target. And the targets were already appearing. Roman eyes were watching. Not always soldiers in armor, sometimes informants in plain clothes. Men who drank in taverns and listened. Religious authorities whispered. Crowds swelled. And inside the group, Judas's quiet calculations grew sharper. He'd talk about strategy, about influence, about the kind of kingdom they could build, spoken softly, like he was offering wisdom. But Simon could smell something off in it. Judas wanted results. Jesus wanted transformation. Simon stood between them, torn, because Simon, too, wanted results. He wanted Rome humiliated, the proud exposed, the hungry fed, the world fixed. He wanted the kind of Messiah that makes enemies bleed. Jesus kept talking about loving enemies. That phrase landed like grit in Simon's teeth. Love enemies? Simon had enemies. He'd watched friends get squeezed by taxes. He'd watched families lose everything. He'd watched men drown. He'd tasted humiliation. Love enemies felt like swallowing poison on purpose. And yet Jesus said it with the calm of someone who wasn't naive, someone who knew exactly how violent the world was and refused to let violence have the final word. That refusal created the deepest tension in Simon, the tension between the man he was and the man he was being asked to become. Then, another escalation. Jesus led them to a mountain. The night air was cold. The climb was hard. Sweat dried on skin. Stars burned above like silent witnesses. And up there, Jesus didn't just teach crowds. He chose. He named 12 men, not randomly, not politely, intentionally, like assembling a crew for a mission. When Jesus looked at Simon, it felt like being seen by fire. "You are Simon," Jesus said, and then he changed it. "Peter." Rock. Not because Simon was stable. Irony matters here. Simon was the opposite of stable. He was wind, spark, impulse. But Jesus named him not for what he was, but for what he could become. Like calling a terrified boy brave until someday he believes it. That naming created two reactions at once. In Simon, Peter now, it created a surge of pride, the kind that lifts your chest and makes you feel chosen. In Judas, it created something colder. You didn't need Judas to say it. You could feel it in the air. Why him? Rivalry doesn't always shout. Sometimes it smiles and takes notes. From that moment, the stakes changed. Peter wasn't just a follower. He was being positioned, being molded, becoming a symbol. Symbols attract enemies, and enemies don't fight fair. The next days were a blur of roads and villages, of dust and arguments, of miracles that made people weep and others plot. Peter watched lepers' skin clear, raw sores smoothing like time reversed. He watched the hungry fed in ways that made no economic sense. He watched demons, whatever they were, scream at the name of Jesus like animals cornered. He also watched Jesus refuse obvious power. Crowds wanted to crown him. Peter could feel it, this swelling energy that could become revolution. But Jesus slipped away, as if the spotlight disgusted him. That refusal began to frustrate Peter almost as much as it fascinated him, because Peter wanted the story to move faster. He wanted a climax. He wanted victory. He didn't realize yet that the victory would look nothing like his fantasies. And then came the moment that cracked the group's surface calm. A storm. Not metaphorical. A real one. A violent Galilean storm that rose so quickly it felt like the lake had been waiting to ambush them. The sky turned ugly. Wind slapped the water into fists. Waves punched the boat. These were fishermen. They knew storms. But this one felt personal, like the sea was angry at them for daring to exist. The boat bucked. Water poured in. Peter's hands flew to ropes by instinct. He shouted orders. The others panicked. Even professionals panic when death feels close enough to taste. And Jesus? Jesus was asleep. Asleep in the chaos, head on a cushion, breathing steady like a child in a safe home. Peter snapped. He grabbed Jesus, shook him. Anger and fear tangled together like a net. "Do you not care that we're dying?" That question was bigger than the storm. It was the question under Peter's whole life. God, do you care? Jesus stood. He looked at the waves, not with awe, not with fear, but with the kind of authority that makes you feel small. He spoke. The wind dropped. The waves flattened. Sudden quiet. Unnatural. As if reality itself had been corrected. The men stared at the water like it had betrayed them by obeying. And Peter, chest heaving, felt the answer to his question crash into him. God cared enough to step into the boat. But God also cared enough to expose Peter's fear, because Jesus turned to them and said almost sadly, "Why are you so afraid?" Peter couldn't answer. He could only stare, realizing the most unsettling truth of all. The greatest danger wasn't Rome, or storms, or Pharisees. The greatest danger was being close to someone who could calm the sea, and still not fully understand who he was. That night, as the boat drifted in eerie calm, Peter felt rivalry stirring again, inside and outside. Outside, the world that would not tolerate this kind of authority. Inside, Judas, who would interpret power in the most convenient way possible. And inside Peter himself, the old Simon, the survivalist fisherman, who wanted a Messiah he could predict and control. Jesus was not controllable. And that meant Peter's transformation would not be gentle. It would be a fight, not against the lake this time, against his own instincts, against false visions of glory, against a competitor who smiled and planned and quietly measured everyone's usefulness. Peter didn't know it yet, but the moment he accepted the name Rock, he stepped into a rivalry that would sharpen into betrayal. One that would force him to answer a question far more terrifying than, "Do you care we're dying?" It would force him to answer, when fear finally puts a knife to your throat. Who will you become? They walked north, away from the familiar shoreline that had once been Peter's whole universe, and the land changed as if it was trying to warn them. The air got sharper. The hills rose like knuckles. Villages thinned out. And then, almost like stepping into someone else's nightmare, they reached a place that didn't feel Jewish at all. Caesarea Philippi, a city with Roman, Polish, and pagan shadows, where carved stone gods stared with blank confidence, and a yawning cave in the rock was rumored to be a doorway to the underworld. Even the water there looked wrong. Dark, cold, swallowed by stone. It was the kind of place that makes a faithful man uncomfortable, because it dares you to ask what you really believe when you're not surrounded by your own people, your own prayers, your own rules. And Jesus chose that place, of all places, to ask the question that would split Peter's life in two. They were on the road, dust on their feet, sweat drying on their necks, the disciples still buzzing from miracles and arguments. Still, half convinced the climax would be a public victory. Peter could feel it in the way Judas talked lately, more intense, more impatient, always turning conversations toward influence, toward leverage, toward when Jesus would finally make the big move. Judas had a way of speaking that made people feel foolish for doubting him. He could turn caution into cowardice with a sentence. He could turn faith into a strategy. He was always there, close enough to hear everything, quiet enough to seem harmless, smart enough to plant ideas that felt like your own. And Peter was not blind. He could sense the competition in the air like a change in weather. Then Jesus stopped walking. He turned and looked at them, and the usual warmth in his face sharpened into something almost surgical. Who do people say I am? Easy question. Safe question. The kind that lets everyone talk without bleeding. They answered quickly, voices overlapping. John the Baptist. Elijah. One of the prophets. Jesus let the answers hang for a beat as if tasting them and finding them thin. Then he stepped closer, eyes fixed on them like he was pulling them into deep water again. But you, he said, who do you say I am? The road went quiet. This wasn't a theological quiz. This was a knife held at the center of their story. Because if they said the wrong thing, everything they'd risked would collapse into madness. And if they said the right thing, the world would notice. Peter felt everyone hesitate. He felt Judas's stillness like a held breath. He felt the fear underneath their silence. If we name him, we can't unname him later. And in that tight moment, Peter did what he always did. He acted first. You are the Christ, Peter said, the Son of the living God. The words came out with a force that surprised even him, like something inside him finally bursting through. For a second, the sky itself seemed to pause. Jesus' face softened, something like relief flickering there, but deeper. Like a father seeing his child finally speak truth. Blessed are you, Jesus said. Then he said something that hit Peter like a crown dropping onto his head. You are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church. And then, another sentence, heavier than any net full of fish. I will give you the keys. Keys, authority, entrustment. It should have felt like pure victory. Instead, Peter's stomach tightened, because he could feel eyes on him, Judas's eyes. And not just Judas. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the old rivals turned comrades, suddenly quiet in a way that felt like recalibration. Keys change a room. They create hierarchy. They spark jealousy. They invite plots. Peter had been named Rock before, but this sounded like destiny with teeth. And then Jesus did the cruelest thing possible. Right after the moment that should have been triumph, he started talking about death. We're going to Jerusalem, Jesus said, as calmly as if he were saying they'd visit a market. I will suffer. I will be rejected. I will be killed. Peter's brain rejected it instantly. It felt obscene. How could a Messiah talk like a loser? The Messiah was supposed to crush enemies, not be crushed. The Messiah was supposed to bring the kingdom in fire and glory. Peter could practically hear Judas's unspoken agreement in the air. Yes, exactly. This is wrong. Peter stepped forward, grabbed Jesus by the arm, pulled him aside like you pull a friend away from saying something stupid in public. No, Peter hissed. This will never happen to you. He meant it as loyalty, as protection, as devotion. Jesus turned so fast it startled him. His eyes cut through Peter like cold metal. Get behind me, Satan! The words hit like a slap. Peter went still, humiliated, as if the ground had shifted under his feet. Jesus didn't call him that because Peter was evil. He called him that because Peter, without realizing it, was offering the oldest temptation in the world, a kingdom without a cross, glory without sacrifice, salvation without suffering. And Judas listened to that exchange with a face that revealed nothing, but something in him hardened. You could feel it, like wax cooling into shape. From that moment, the story bent toward its darkest path. Because once Peter had spoken the truth, once he'd been given keys, he also discovered something brutal. Being chosen did not mean being spared. It meant being tested. Not long after, Jesus took Peter with James and John up another mountain. Night wrapped the world below them, and the climb scraped their lungs. Peter's legs burned. His mind still churned with the insult, Satan, and the confusing talk of death. Then, up there, something happened that didn't fit into any category of normal. Jesus changed. Not like a man putting on a different expression, like reality itself slipping. His face shone, not with reflected light, but with a brightness that seemed to come from inside his bones. His clothes turned blindingly white, as if the fabric had swallowed lightning. The air felt charged, as if the mountain had become an altar. And beside him, impossible, figures appeared. Ancient, heavy with meaning. Moses and Elijah, the law and the prophets, standing like witnesses at a cosmic verdict. Peter's mouth went dry. This was what he'd wanted, wasn't it? Proof, glory. The kind of scene that could crush doubt and terrify enemies. He didn't know what to do with it, so he did what he always did. He spoke. "Let's build shelters," Peter blurted out, words tumbling. "Let's keep this. Keep it. Trap it. Preserve the peak so they wouldn't have to go back down into dust and danger." And then a cloud swallowed them. Not a gentle mist. A dense, oppressive presence that made Peter's skin prickle. A voice came out of it, deep, unavoidable, like the world speaking from underneath itself. "This is my son. Listen to him." Peter froze. His heartbeat became loud in his ears. He felt small in a way that was almost physical, like being pressed into the earth. When the cloud lifted, the figures were gone. The brightness faded. Jesus looked like Jesus again. Dusty feet, tired eyes, human. And that was the twist. The glory didn't erase the coming suffering. It didn't cancel the cross. It didn't turn Jesus into a warrior king in armor. It just confirmed that the one who would be rejected was still the chosen one. On the way down, Jesus told them not to talk about what they'd seen. Not yet. Peter hated that instruction. He wanted to shout it from rooftops. He wanted leverage. He wanted the story to move the way he imagined it should. But Jesus kept tightening the spiral, bringing them closer to Jerusalem, closer to collision. And as they moved toward the city, the rivalries grew sharper, not only with the religious authorities, who now watched like hawks, but within their own little band, where ambition started to ferment. The disciples argued about greatness like children fighting over inheritance. Who would sit closest? Who would be remembered? Who would rule when the kingdom arrived? And Judas. Judas fanned that hunger with soft words. Peter could feel it. Judas offering versions of the future that sounded sensible, efficient, strong. The kind of future where the Messiah's power was used properly, where enemies were dealt with, where the movement didn't waste time on people who couldn't offer anything back. Peter didn't have Judas's smoothness, but he had instincts. He could smell when someone's devotion was turning into ownership. Then they reached Jerusalem, and Jerusalem was a furnace. The city was swollen with pilgrims. Roman soldiers prowled like wolves among sheep, armor clinking, eyes scanning for trouble. The temple loomed, beautiful, enormous, the heart of faith and the nest of politics. Money changed hands everywhere, and you could feel anxiety under the festivities, like a drumbeat only the nervous could hear. Jesus entered the city and people shouted, palms waved, hopes surged. It looked for a moment like Peter's dream might come true. The Messiah welcomed, the kingdom arriving with celebration. But Jesus didn't head for a throne. He went straight to the temple. And there, he did something that made Peter's blood go cold. He flipped tables. Coins scattered across stone like metallic rain. Merchants shouted. Animals panicked. People stumbled back. Jesus' voice cut through the chaos, furious, righteous, impossible to ignore. Peter watched in a mix of awe and dread. This wasn't a miracle to delight crowds. This was a declaration of war. Because the temple was not just a holy place. It was an economy, a power structure, a machine. And Jesus just jammed a stick into its gears in broad daylight. The authorities' faces tightened like fists. They didn't rush him immediately. Not yet. They were too political for that. Instead, they watched. They whispered. They started planning. That's when Peter truly understood the stakes. This wasn't going to end with applause. This was going to end with blood. The days that followed were like walking on a thin crust over a fire. Jesus taught publicly, and every word became a spark. He told stories that made the powerful look like thieves in the eyes of the poor. He answered traps with questions that snapped shut on the trappers. He spoke of hypocrisy like it was rot you could smell. Peter stood nearby, scanning crowds, seeing the danger multiply. He saw men in clean robes exchange quick looks. He saw strangers drift too close, listening too intently. He saw the Roman presence thicken at the edges. At night, when they retreated, Judas was quieter than before, too quiet, like a man making a decision. And then came the private dinner, a borrowed room, oil lamps, the smell of bread and herbs, the familiar ritual of Passover, heavy with memory, slavery, deliverance, blood on doorposts. Peter wanted this night to be safe, a pocket of calm before the storm. But Jesus sat with them as if he were already grieving. Then, in a move that stunned everyone, Jesus got up, wrapped a towel around himself, and knelt. He began washing their feet, dusty, sweaty, filthy from roads. The task of a servant. Peter recoiled like he'd been slapped again. "No," he said, voice sharp. "You will never wash my feet." He couldn't stand the inversion. He couldn't stand the Messiah kneeling. It felt wrong in his bones. Jesus looked up at him with that same calm that made refusal feel impossible. "If I don't wash you," Jesus said, "you have no part with me." Peter's face flushed. Shame, fear, love, all tangled up. "Then, wash all of me," he blurted out, immediately swinging to the other extreme the way he always did. Jesus washed his feet. Peter stared at the water pooling in the basin, dirty with road grime, and felt the message land like a weight. The kingdom Jesus brought was not built on dominance. It was built on humiliating love. That kind of love doesn't just challenge Rome. It challenges every selfish instinct in a man. Then Jesus spoke words that made the room feel colder. "One of you will betray me." The disciples reacted with confusion, with denial, with panic. Peter's eyes darted. "Who? Who?" and landed on Judas, whose face was carefully blank. Peter leaned toward John, who sat close to Jesus, and signaled, "Ask him. Find out." The tension in Peter's chest was unbearable. His mind raced through possibilities. He pictured an enemy slipping a knife into Jesus' back in an alley. He pictured guards storming the room. Jesus named no one openly, but the air shifted toward Judas like iron toward a magnet. And Judas stood. He left. The door closed behind him with a soft sound that somehow felt like thunder. Peter's hands curled into fists. He wanted to chase Judas, tackle him, force the truth out of him. But Jesus didn't stop him. Jesus didn't expose him. Jesus let him go. That was another twist, one Peter couldn't understand and hated. Jesus seemed to be allowing betrayal to happen, as if he were walking straight toward the trap with eyes open. Then Jesus spoke about his body, his blood, about a new covenant, about sacrifice. The words were dense with meaning and dread. Peter listened, trying to interpret them like strategy, like coded plans. Then came the moment that burned into Peter's pride and fear. Jesus looked at him. "Peter," he said, voice low, intimate, almost tender. "Before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times. Peter felt insult flare like fire. "Deny? Him? Never." Peter thumped his chest with words, with conviction. "Even if I have to die with you," he insisted, "I will never deny you." The others echoed him. Brave talk in lamplight. But Judas was already moving through the city like a shadow with a destination. Later they walked out into the night. The air smelled like olives and damp earth. Jerusalem hummed in the distance, restless, They crossed to a garden, Gethsemane, where trees twisted like old hands in the moonlight. Jesus told them to stay awake. He went a little distance away and collapsed into prayer with a kind of anguish Peter had never seen in him before. Not fear of pain, something deeper, as if he were wrestling the weight of the world itself. Peter tried to stay alert. He did, but exhaustion is a brutal enemy. His eyes drooped. His head nodded. The night pressed down. He woke to Jesus' voice. Disappointed? Pained. Could you not watch with me 1 hour? Peter swallowed shame, promised himself he'd do better. Then he slept again. A second time, Jesus woke them. Again, that quiet disappointment. A third time, the sound wasn't Jesus. It was footsteps. Many. Torchlight flickered between trees like angry insects. Metal glinted. Voices murmured with purpose. Peter's blood ran cold. A crowd emerged. Temple guards, armed men, faces half hidden by shadows, driven by someone at the front. Judas. He stepped forward with a familiarity that made Peter's stomach turn. He kissed Jesus. Not a dramatic kiss. A simple, intimate sign, like a friend greeting a friend. It was disgusting precisely because it looked normal. The guards moved in. Peter's body reacted before his mind could. This was his territory. Threat, sudden violence, survival. He yanked out a sword, how he had one, when the group preached peace is its own ugly detail, and swung. The blade flashed. A man screamed. An ear hit the ground. For a split second, Peter felt the savage satisfaction of action. I did something. I fought. I wasn't helpless. Then Jesus spoke sharply. Put it away. Jesus stepped toward the wounded man and, impossibly, healed him. Right there, in the chaos, a miracle. But not the kind Peter wanted. Not a miracle of conquest. A miracle of restraint. Peter stared, disoriented. The guards grabbed Jesus. The disciples scattered like frightened birds. And Peter ran too. Not because he didn't love Jesus. Because fear is faster than loyalty when it finally gets its hands on your throat. He stopped at a distance, panting, hiding behind trees, watching torches move away with Jesus in chains. Then something in him, shame, stubbornness, whatever was left of his rock, made him follow, not close, not bravely, but near enough to see, near enough to suffer. They took Jesus to the high priest's courtyard. The night air there was colder, sharper. A fire burned in the center, and people gathered around it. Guards, servants, curious onlookers, faces lit by flames that made everyone look guilty. Peter hovered at the edge, trying to look casual, trying to look like he belonged. The fire heat warmed his hands, but not his insides. His heart hammered like it was trying to break out of his ribs. Inside, voices rose. Accusations, questions, the sounds of a trial twisted into a performance. Outside, a servant girl looked at Peter. At first it was just a glance. Then her eyes narrowed. "You," she said. "You were with him." Time slowed. Peter felt the weight of the room shift. Heads turned slightly. The fire popped. Somewhere inside, Jesus' voice rose, then fell. Peter's mind flashed images. Arrest, beating, crucifixion. He had seen Rome's punishments before. He knew what crosses looked like when the sun baked them. He knew the smell. Fear poured into him like cold water. "I don't know what you're talking about," Peter said. "Lie one." He moved away from the fire, trying to melt into shadows. Another voice caught him. Another servant. Another observer. This man was with Jesus of Nazareth. Peter's throat tightened. His hands shook. He tried to sound irritated, offended, like the accusation was ridiculous. "I am not," he snapped. "Lie too." He edged farther, praying no one would recognize him, praying the night would swallow him. But fear isn't satisfied. It keeps chewing. A third voice, sharper now, confident, someone who had been paying attention. "Surely you are one of them," the man said. "Your accent gives you away. Peter felt something inside him fracture. This was the moment. The test. The prophecy. And Peter, who had promised death, who had swung a sword, who had declared Jesus the Christ, Peter heard himself become someone he didn't recognize. "I don't know the man!" he shouted, and to make it convincing he cursed, he spit out the denial with the ugliness of panic, as if profanity could build a wall between him and the truth. Lie 3. And right then, like a blade sliding between ribs, the rooster crowed. A small sound, a ridiculous sound, but it hit Peter harder than any scream. Inside the courtyard, at that exact moment, Jesus turned. He looked at Peter, not with hatred, not with, "I told you so," not even with anger, with grief, with knowing, with a sorrow so clean it made Peter feel filthy. Peter's lungs locked, his vision blurred, the firelight smeared into tears. He stumbled away from the courtyard like a drunk, like a wounded animal, like a man leaving his own soul behind. He found darkness beyond the walls, and broke. Not polite tears, not cinematic tears. He wept until his chest hurt, until his throat burned, until his body shook with the violence of it. Because now, Peter understood the most horrifying twist in his story. He wasn't just capable of failure. He was capable of betraying the person he loved most to save his own skin. And in that realization, the title Rock felt like mockery. The keys felt like a joke. The future felt impossible. And somewhere in the city, Judas, who had traded intimacy for silver, was discovering that betrayal has teeth, and it bites the betrayer too. But Peter didn't know that yet. All Peter knew was the taste of shame, and the sound of a rooster slicing the night open like a verdict. And dawn was coming. Dawn crawled over Jerusalem like a weak apology. The city that had been a furnace of shouting and torchlight became something worse. Quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you hear your own heartbeat and hate it. Somewhere behind stone walls, roosters kept doing what roosters do, announcing morning like nothing happened, while Peter walked as if his feet were borrowed from another man. He didn't go home. Home didn't exist anymore. He moved through alleys and corners, keeping to shadows, because shame has this instinct. It wants darkness. It wants hiding places. And it wants to shrink until nobody can see what you've become. Inside him, 2 Peters fought. One was the fisherman who knew how to survive, deny, vanish, live. The other was the man who had shouted, "You are the Christ," and meant it. And now, the second Peter had been crushed under the weight of the first. The city began to stir. Merchants yawned. Water was carried. Doors opened. Normal life crept forward. Indecently normal. Then the rumor hit like a stone to the teeth. They were taking Jesus to Pilate. Rome had entered the story in the loudest possible way, not just as background oppression, but as executioner. Pilate didn't care about Jewish theological arguments. Pilate cared about crowds and control. If the leaders framed Jesus as a threat, Pilate would treat him like one. Peter tried to get close, failed, tried again. From a distance, he saw movement. A bound man shoved along by soldiers, a cluster of religious leaders with faces stiff as masks, and a crowd that smelled blood the way sharks smell it, curious, half excited, half afraid. And then, another twist, another gut punch. Peter saw Judas, not triumphant, not smug. Judas moved like someone whose skin had turned too tight. His eyes darted, wild. He looked less like a villain and more like a man realizing the cliff edge is under his own feet, too. Judas tried to undo it. That's the ugly part people forget. Betrayal often thinks it's controlling the outcome until the outcome starts controlling the betrayer. He threw the silver back. He argued. He pleaded. He raged. The leaders didn't care. Money clattered. Judas stumbled away. And Peter, watching, felt a cold truth slide into place. The competitor he'd sensed, the smooth strategist, the man who wanted power, without a cross, wasn't winning. He was drowning. The difference was, Judas would drown in despair. Peter was about to learn there was another option, The hours that followed became a nightmare stitched together by sound, shouts, orders, slaps, laughter too sharp to be human. Jesus was beaten, mocked, spat on. A crown of thorns isn't just symbolic. Thorns tear. They snag. They leave blood in the hairline and the eyes. Peter caught glimpses, a face swollen, lips split, shoulders reddened by lashes. The Messiah. Peter had imagined, glorious, unstoppable, was being reduced to a spectacle, and that reduction had a smell, blood and dust, iron and sweat, the sour breath of a crowd packed too tight. Somewhere someone yelled, "Crucify him!" Peter's stomach turned. This wasn't righteous anger. This was mob hunger, the kind that makes people feel clean by watching someone else be destroyed. Jesus was dragged out carrying a crossbeam, wood scraped by previous victims, soaked in old suffering. He stumbled. The soldiers shoved him. A man was forced to help carry the load. Peter followed at the edge, heart pounding, mind splitting. I could do something. I'll get killed. I should do something. I already denied him. The hill came into view. Golgotha, the place of the skull. It looked like what it was, a public warning, a billboard of fear. Peter had seen crucifixions before. Everyone under Rome had. Crucifixion wasn't just death, it was theater, slow, humiliating, designed to teach crowds the lesson of obedience. The hammer rose. The first nail hit. A sound you don't forget. Wood, metal, flesh. Like the world itself, cracking. Peter's mouth went dry. A wave of nausea rolled through him. People near him flinched, and then leaned forward like they couldn't look away. Some laughed, some cried, some just stared. Jesus was lifted. The cross dropped into its hole with a jolt that made his body strain against the nails. And the sky did something strange. Light dulled. Wind shifted. It felt like creation was holding a breath. It didn't want to hold. Peter stood hidden among strangers, shaking so hard his teeth hurt. He saw the sign posted above Jesus. An accusation turned into mockery. He saw soldiers gambling for clothing like bored men killing time. He saw religious leaders sneering, proud they'd finally silenced the nuisance. And he saw women, braver than him, standing close enough to be seen. That burned. Then Jesus spoke. Not loud, not theatrical. Words that sounded like a man doing the impossible, forgiving while being murdered. Hours passed like years. Then came the final twist on that hill, the thing nobody expected from a man being executed. Jesus, voice thin, spoke again, and then went still. The moment death finally landed, it felt like the world lurched. A centurion, Rome's own instrument, looked up at the dead man and said something that should have been impossible for a Roman soldier to admit. Peter heard it and felt his insides collapse. Even the enemy could see something holy in what had happened. When the body was taken down, when the crowd dispersed with that horrible casualness people have after watching tragedy, Peter didn't feel relieved. He felt empty. And emptiness, for a man like Peter, was a trap. It whispers the same lie Judas listened to. It's over. You ruined it. There's no way back. Peter disappeared into grief. Days blurred. The disciples hid behind locked doors. Every footstep outside sounded like soldiers coming for them. Every knock made hearts jump. Peter's mind kept replaying the courtyard fire, the 3 denials, the rooster, the look in Jesus' eyes. Then, early in the morning, another rumor came. So absurd, it sounded like cruelty. The tomb was open. The body was gone. Some of the women were saying they had seen him. Alive. Peter bolted. He ran the way he used to run down the shore when a net tore, panicked, desperate, lungs burning. He reached the tomb and found it just as they said. Empty, grave cloths lying there like a shed skin. He stared into the hollow space where death should have been final. And in that emptiness, a different possibility opened. Maybe the story wasn't ending. Maybe it was turning. Soon after, However it happened, wherever it happened, Peter encountered Jesus alive. Not a ghost, not a metaphor. Alive enough to speak, to look, to be real in the room. Peter didn't know what to do with himself. Shame surged up again like bile. How do you face someone you denied? How do you meet the eyes of the one you abandoned? Jesus didn't humiliate him. Jesus didn't deliver a speech. Jesus did something far more terrifying. He stayed. He showed up again and again, teaching them, steadying them, turning their panic into purpose. And he spoke about a mission that sounded impossible, taking what they had seen and heard into the world. Peter listened, but the old wound kept pulsing. I'm not worthy. I failed. I'm the wrong man. Then, one day, they were back where Peter's life had started. The Sea of Galilee. The same water. The same smell. The same horizon. The disciples were fishing again. Not because they'd given up on Jesus, but because waiting can make a man reach for familiar work like a lifeline. They fished all night and caught nothing. Like the old days, like a cruel joke repeating itself. At dawn, a figure stood on the shore. "Children," the voice called, "have you any fish?" "No." "Throw your net on the right side." They did, and the net filled. So heavy it felt like the first miracle all over again. John's voice trembled. "It is the Lord." Peter didn't think. He threw himself into the water. That detail matters. The rock plunging in, splashing like a fool, swimming hard toward the shore because love makes you reckless in a different way than fear does. On land, there was a fire. Fish cooking. Bread. The smell hit Peter like a memory of the courtyard. Firelight, smoke. Except this time the fire was not for denial. It was for restoration. Jesus fed them. Quietly. Normally. As if the resurrection had not turned the universe upside down, as if heaven could sit in the sand and eat breakfast. Then Jesus looked at Peter, not in accusation, in invitation. "Simon, son of John," he said, using the old name, the raw name, "do you love me?" Peter's throat tightened. "Yes, Lord. You know I love you." Jesus answered, "Feed my lambs." Then again, "Do you love me?" "Yes, Lord. You know I love you." "Take care of my sheep." Then a third time, and the third time hurt, because Peter knew exactly what Jesus was doing. 3 questions for 3 denials. Not as punishment, as healing, pressing on the bruise until the poison could leave. Peter's voice cracked. "Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you." Jesus said, "Feed my sheep." In that moment, Peter understood the twist of his own story. Jesus wasn't building his church on Peter's perfection. He was building it on Peter's forgiven failure. A rock isn't a rock because it never breaks. A rock is a rock because it stays when storms hit. And Jesus, with those words, was turning Peter's shame into a calling. The man who knew what it felt like to collapse would become. The man who knew how to lift others up. But Jesus didn't let Peter keep the illusion that leadership would be safe. He spoke of Peter's future in images that sounded like chains. "There will come a time," Jesus implied, "when you will be led where you do not want to go." Peter didn't fully understand yet. He would. Soon after, Jesus was gone from their sight, and the disciples returned to Jerusalem. Still fragile, still afraid, but carrying something new. A spark that refused to die. Then came Pentecost. A sound like wind tore through the house where they were gathered. Not a gentle breeze, an invasive roar, as if heaven had kicked in the door. Flames, like tongues of fire, appeared over them. Not burning hair, not scorching skin, but igniting courage. Peter, who had once cowered by a courtyard fire, stood up in public. And this is where you see the miracle in him. Not the walking on water kind, the deeper kind. He spoke, not with the polished smoothness of Judas, not with the academic carefulness of priests. He spoke like a man who had been broken open and filled with something stronger than fear. The crowd gathered, some amazed, some mocking, some angry. People always do that when truth makes noise. Peter didn't back down. He told them about Jesus, about death, resurrection, and the weird, terrifying mercy that kept showing up in the story. He told them repentance wasn't humiliation. It was rescue. He told them the kingdom wasn't a political stunt. It was a new creation, and people responded. Not politely, not mildly, but as if their hearts had been grabbed. Thousands joined. That day, the church didn't feel like an institution. It felt like an outbreak, like hope spreading. But outbreaks attract exterminators. The authorities moved quickly. The same system that had crushed Jesus now tried to suffocate his followers. Peter and John were arrested, questioned, threatened. Peter, who once denied Jesus to a servant girl, looked at powerful men and said, in essence, "We can't stop speaking." That wasn't bravado. That was transformation. He healed the sick in the name of Jesus, and crowds poured in. He confronted hypocrisy inside the community, too, because power can rot a movement from within as easily as enemies can attack it from outside. And here, Peter faced another kind of rival, the kind that doesn't wear official robes or Roman armor, the counterfeit, a man who saw miracles and thought, "I can use this." In the stories that circulated among early Christians, one figure stands out as a dangerous competitor, a man often remembered as Simon the magician, someone who dazzled crowds with signs and tried to buy spiritual authority like it was a commodity. Whether every detail of those stories is remembered perfectly or not, the point lands with force. Peter had to fight not only persecution, but corruption, people who wanted the power of faith without the surrender of faith, because that's always the rivalry at the heart of the church, authentic sacrifice versus convenient performance. Peter became, slowly, the kind of leader who could smell the difference. As the years passed, the movement widened. It spilled beyond Jerusalem into Judea, Samaria, and into the Gentile world. And Peter, raised with deep boundaries, was pushed into another uncomfortable transformation. One day, he received a vision that shattered his assumptions about who belonged. The message wasn't subtle. God was doing something larger than Peter's cultural comfort. The Spirit was moving among people Peter had been taught to keep at arm's length. Peter obeyed. He stepped into homes he would once have avoided. He ate with people considered unclean. He watched the Spirit fall on outsiders and realized, stunned, that God's mercy was not controlled by human borders. That decision created conflict, not only with outsiders, but inside the community. Some believers hated the idea of opening the door that wide. They wanted a small, controlled holiness. Peter had to argue, had to insist, had to live the very lesson Jesus had burned into him. The kingdom is not built by gatekeeping, it's built by grace. And grace has enemies. Eventually, the center of gravity shifted. The apostles scattered, preaching, organizing, surviving. Peter's path led toward Rome, the belly of the beast, the capital of the empire that had crucified his Lord. Rome was not just a city. It was an idea made stone. Its roads were veins. Its laws were teeth. Its arenas were mouths that ate people for entertainment. And in Rome, the church grew anyway, quietly, stubbornly, like a plant pushing through cracked pavement. But then came the reign of terror, Nero. When a great fire ravaged Rome, rumors swarmed. To protect himself, Nero needed a scapegoat. Christians, already strange in Roman eyes, refusing emperor worship, meeting in secret, were perfect targets. Persecution broke over the believers like a wave of knives. People were arrested, tortured, killed in grotesque public displays. The empire turned human bodies into props. Peter, who had once run, faced the old instinct again. Survive. Tradition says friends urged him to flee Rome, to escape, to live and lead elsewhere. And Peter did start to leave, moving down a road, heart hammering, mind spinning with the familiar calculus of safety. Then came the moment that haunts Christian imagination like a bell in fog. On the road, Peter encountered Jesus. "Lord," Peter said, shaken, "where are you going?" Jesus' answer, however it was exactly phrased in the telling, landed like a blade. He was going to Rome to suffer again in his people. Peter understood. This was the final test, the last chance to become the rock his name demanded. He turned back into the city, back toward danger, back toward the fate he once swore he'd face, and then failed. This time, he didn't fail. Peter was arrested, and here the hook from the beginning returns, not as a gross spectacle, but as the final signature of a life transformed. He was sentenced to crucifixion, the same death as Jesus. But Peter, still carrying a strange mix of humility and reverence, asked for an indignity that was also a confession. He did not want to die in the same posture as his Lord, so they inverted him. Upside down, a body nailed with blood rushing to the head, lungs fighting gravity, the world literally flipped. Executioners likely laughed. Rome loved humiliation. Yet Peter's request turned humiliation into meaning. Even at the end, he would not pretend to be equal to Jesus. He would die as a forgiven man, not a rival. And in that upside-down death, the fisherman finally finished his long war with fear. Rome thought it was erasing him. Instead, it made him permanent. Because martyrdom doesn't just kill a leader, it plants a story into the ground where it keeps growing. Peter's followers remembered where he died, where he was buried. Over centuries, the memory gathered stone around it, until the name Peter became anchored in the heart of Rome itself. Keys and rock, symbols that outlived emperors, became shorthand for continuity, leadership, and a faith that refuses to be silenced. But your question isn't only about Rome. It's about Nigeria. So how does this fisherman's story, born on a Galilean shoreline, hammered into history on Roman wood, become beloved in West Africa? Because Peter's story travels well to places that understand pressure. Nigeria is home to vast, vibrant Christian communities, Catholic, Anglican, Pentecostal, and many others. Across Nigeria, churches carry Peter's name because his meaning is universal. He is the apostle who failed loudly and was restored publicly, the leader who learned that authority is service, the man who stood up under threats, the witness who faced death without surrendering his message. And the devotion isn't abstract. In Abeokuta, for example, there is a long Christian heritage tied directly to Peter's name. Catholics established a community that marked June 29th, the feast of Saints Peter and Paul, as a foundational day, and a cathedral there bears both apostles' names. In the same city, Anglicans also have a cathedral church of Saint Peter, another reminder that Peter isn't owned by one tradition. He's a shared ancestor in faith, a bridge figure. Go through Nigerian cities and towns and you'll find Saint Peter parishes, places where ordinary people gather for the very thing Peter was told to do: feed sheep, teach, baptize, encourage. Hold the line when life gets heavy, and that heavy part matters. In parts of Nigeria, Christians have lived with real tension: political instability, economic pressure, communal conflict, and, at times, violence targeted at religious communities. In that landscape, Peter's life isn't a stained glass fantasy. It's a survival manual written in blood and mercy. When fear makes you deny what you love, there can still be a way back. When power threatens you, courage can be learned. When your faith is mocked, your mission can still grow. When you're tempted by shortcuts, by Judas-style strategy or magician-style counterfeit, truth still has a spine. Even Peter's contradictions make him relatable. Nigerians don't venerate him because he was flawless. They venerate him because he was human, and because God still used him. There's another layer, too. Peter is tied to unity. In Nigeria, where Christianity is diverse and energetic, Peter's keys become a symbol of connection to a wider global church, especially for Catholics who see the Bishop of Rome as Peter's successor. That sense of belonging to something older than any government, larger than any ethnicity, wider than any border, has deep emotional weight, and Peter is tied to work. He's a patron figure for fishermen and for those who live by the mercy of unpredictable waters, literal rivers and coasts, but also metaphorical waters, unstable jobs, uncertain futures. Peter knows what it is to come home with empty nets. He also knows what it is to be surprised by abundance. That rhythm, loss and provision, echoes in the lives of many. So when Nigerians celebrate Peter, especially around the June 29th feast with Peter and Paul, they aren't just honoring a distant saint. They're honoring a man whose story says, "Your worst moment doesn't get the final word. The rooster doesn't get the final word. The cross doesn't get the final word. And even an empire doesn't get the final word. Only the voice that met Peter on the shore, feeding him breakfast after failure, gets that. That's why Peter endures. Because in the end, the fisherman didn't become a rock by being hard. He became a rock by being held again and again until he could hold others. And that is a legacy strong enough to cross oceans, enter new languages, and find a home in Nigeria's churches, prayers, and names, where Peter is still doing what he was told to do, feeding sheep.